All right, buckle up, because today we're going deep, diving into Canadian identity, or maybe the lack of it. We're looking at the 2019 election, but not the usual way. No polls, no pundits. We're going through the eyes of one very opinionated Canadian.
Yeah, it's a reflection piece written right after the election. It's raw, unfiltered, what it means to be Canadian in a, quote, post-national state.
And they don't hold back.
Yeah.
Not at all. Disillusioned with Trudeau winning again. Worried about progressivism in Canada and, like, this whole soul-searching thing. Trying to figure out what makes someone truly Canadian. So before we unpack all that, same question our author is wrestling with. What does it even mean to be Canadian? In this post-national world, think about it. We'll come back to that.
That term, though, post-national, is key to understanding their anxiety. They see it as Canada lacking a core, like a unifying identity.
Yeah, right off the bat, they're clear. Wanted anyone but Trudeau in 2019. Conservatives, NDP, anyone. Just not another Liberal government.
Goes deeper than just, disliking the Liberals. They really go after Trudeau himself. Shoddy leadership, moral failings, pushing a destructive ideology. Strong words.
And they really zero in on what they see as this obsession with progressive politics at the expense of Canadians, their actual well-being.
Right.
And it's not just any progressive policies they call out. The focus on climate change, social justice, saying it's all the distraction from more pressing issues.
Yeah, you can tell they feel let down deeply, not just by Trudeau, but by Canadians for re-electing him. It makes you wonder, do Canadians really share these values? Or are they just apathetic?
It's like they expected this reckoning, this holding Trudeau accountable for what they see as his failings. And when it didn't happen, it shook them, shook their faith in the country.
Interesting.
Now, of course, it was a minority government, so it's not like Trudeau had free reign. Liberals needed the support of other parties.
Absolutely. And the author touches on that. But they're really dismissive of the idea that this is some kind of win for the right. They say the NDP and Greens, who hold the balance of power now, they'll just rubber stamp whatever the Liberals want or push them further left.
It's almost like for them, the whole spectrum has shifted so far one way. They don't even recognize their own country. It makes you wonder, where were you during that election? Did you feel that disappointment, or were you relieved to see Trudeau win again?
Yeah, that personal reaction to the election. It becomes this springboard for a much bigger crisis of identity. The author really grapples with this. What truly defines a Canadian beyond the superficial?
And they don't sugarcoat it, not one bit. They say Canada's this hodgepodge of peoples, no shared values, no common history, no real peoplehood, whatever that means.
And remember, post-national, they see this lack of a unifying identity as proof that Canada really is a post-national state, but not in a good way. For them, it's a sign that something's missing, something fundamental.
It really gets to the heart of it. What does define a nation? Shared values, history, ethnicity, language, what builds that shared identity that we seem to crave. The author doesn't give us easy answers, but they point to this moment in history where they think things went wrong. For Canada, they say, in the first half of the 20th century, Canada was actually on its way to a more distinct national identity. But World War II disrupted that.
Interesting.
They describe pre-WWII Canada as basically an extension of British culture, which, believe it or not, they see as a good thing, like a solid foundation, a starting point for building something uniquely Canadian.
I see.
But then everything changes after the war. Trudeau Senior's policies, things like multiculturalism, officially enshrined, and increased immigration. They see that as this turning point that diluted that budding Canadian culture. They argue that instead of building on that foundation, they went all in on diversity to the point where it overshadowed any sense of a unified national identity. Bold claim. Makes you think, can a country have a strong national identity while embracing diversity? Are they at odds? Or could they, coexist? Even strengthen each other.
It's worth noting, the author isn't saying, go back to some homogenous past, or that diversity is bad.
Yeah, they're wrestling with this tension between wanting a shared identity and the reality of Canada's diverse population, trying to reconcile the two.
Right. And that search leads them to some interesting places. Like, they call themselves a Canadian nationalist, which is, kind of odd given their whole Canada has no identity thing.
It is. It's like they're yearning for a strong national identity. But they can't say what it should be.
And here's where it gets even more fascinating. They look to Britain for inspiration, which is a little ironic, right? Britain is having its own identity crisis post-Brexit.
Right, trying to find a usable past for Canada, but they're looking at a place that's just as uncertain about its future. What do you think? Desperation. Or is there something to this? Finding inspiration in another country's struggles. They even go so far as to say that true Canadian traditionalism hasn't been discovered yet. Like it's this mythical thing waiting to be unearthed, which begs the question, what would that even look like? Canadian traditionalism.
Good question.
What values, customs, beliefs would you include if you had to define it? Canadian traditionalism. Think about it while we dive deeper into the author's anxieties about Canada's future.
And this search for true Canadian traditionalism, it seems to come from this growing pessimism about the future of Canada.
Yeah, it gets kind of dark to start talking about leaving, like actually leaving Canada.
This isn't just, complaining. They seem to be seriously considering it, leaving the only home they've known.
It's a big reaction. But it shows you how deep this disillusionment goes. They've reached this point where they don't feel like they belong in Canada anymore.
They talk about not trusting Canadians to make the right choices for the future. And it gets even more intense. They suggest that their beliefs might actually make them a target of intolerance.
Wow, that's a scary thought, to feel like you're being pushed out of your own country because of what you believe. It makes you think, what happens when people feel that disconnected from their nation? Apathy, extremism, or just giving up.
Yeah, the author seems to be wrestling with that. They talk about this revolution of sorts being necessary to change Canada's course. That's a loaded language.
It is. It makes you wonder what kind of revolution they're talking
political,
about.
cultural.
That's something.
That's even more radical.
They don't say explicitly, but they do seem to think the system is broken, needs a complete overhaul. They talk about the soul of the people being opposed to what they see as necessary for Canada to be saved. It's almost like they think it's inevitable that Canada is doomed to repeat its mistakes.
And yet, there's this glimmer of something else, in their words, maybe not hope, but defiance. They talk about suffering the consequences alongside other Canadians, but they also say they have limits to what they'll tolerate.
It's interesting, a paradox.
Yeah.
Accepting a shared fate, but with this, escape hatch. Things get too bad.
Yeah, and this raises a question about individual choice versus collective responsibility. When does your own well-being outweigh your loyalty to a nation?
That's tough. How do you balance that? Is there a moral obligation to stay and fight, even if it seems pointless? Or is it okay to just look out for yourself and find a better life somewhere else?
Big questions, no easy answers. And it's even more complicated by the author's fear of being ostracized for their beliefs.
They don't hold back on that either, they say. Most of their countrymen would rather see me dead than have them as a neighbor.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. And it shows the danger of this polarization. When dissenting voices are silenced or pushed aside, it creates this climate of fear.
And intolerance.
Absolutely. In a healthy society, we should be able to debate respectfully, even when we fundamentally disagree.
For sure. But this author seems to have lost faith in that possibility. They feel like their perspective is so outside the mainstream that it's not even worth it to try and engage.
Yeah, I get it, given the extreme language. But it also becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. We retreat into our bubbles, refuse to listen to other views. We just make the divide worse, make real dialogue harder.
It's a vicious cycle, and we see it everywhere, all over the world.
So let's bring this back to you. Where do you stand on this? Ideological tolerance, do you think we can still have? Constructive conversations with people who have completely different views?
Or has it become too toxic? That's a crucial question, because bridging these divides, that's essential for any democracy. It all comes back to Canadian identity. If we can't even agree on the basics of respectful conversation, how can we build a shared vision for the future?
Right. And the author's call for a revolution, it takes on a whole new meaning in this context. Maybe the revolution they want isn't about violence or political upheaval, but about how we relate to each other.
Yeah, recognizing that. True Canadian identity isn't about some imagined past, but about embracing the complexity and contradictions of our present.
That's a good point. Maybe the revolution starts with listening to each other, even when it's hard, even when we disagree. Maybe that's the first step to a more inclusive and unified Canada.
Well, that was a lot. Started with post-election blues, ended up talking revolution, all through one person's eyes.
What's fascinating is this one piece of writing opened up so much about national identity, belonging, what it even means to be Canadian.
It's amazing how much they fit in there. We went from specific policies to, like, the soul of the nation.
Yeah, and it might seem extreme at times, unsettling even, but it makes us face some hard truths about how we define ourselves as Canadians in this, increasingly complex world.
What really stuck with me was this whole usable past thing that we need, like a shared history, traditions, to really feel connected as a nation.
It's very human, wanting to belong, continuity. But in Canada, so diverse, complex history, finding that common thread, it feels impossible sometimes.
Especially with how they talk about true Canadian traditionalism. It's like they're looking for something that doesn't even exist.
Yeah, and that brings us back to this revolution idea. What does it even mean? Here, violent overthrow or something else?
I don't think they mean violence, but they do think big change is needed. Maybe it's a values revolution, a shift in how we think about ourselves in Canada. Maybe it's about recognizing that Canadian identity isn't about some perfect past, but about embracing the complexity, the contradictions of right now, of our present.
Yeah, they're wrestling with that, wanting unity, but also the reality of diversity. They haven't figured it out, how those fit together. But it's important what they're getting at.
I think so, too. And maybe the revolution starts with just being willing to listen to each other, even when we disagree, even when it challenges our ideas of what it means to be Canadian.
That's a good point.
So we're wrapping up, but we want to leave you with this.
As this author thinks.
A revolution is what Canada needs to survive. What kind of revolution do you see? What would it take to create a Canada that's more inclusive, more unified, one that embraces its history and its diverse future? Something to think about. We hope this deep dive gave you some food for thought, and we encourage you to keep exploring these questions on your own.